And now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenters. First, we will have a presentation by Karen Bengtson, Supervisory Regulatory Health Project Manager in the Office of Research and Standards within the Office of Generic Drugs in FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. That will be followed by a presentation by Dr. Wang, a lead pharmacologist within the Division of Therapeutic Performance 1, also within the Office of Research and Standards within the Office of Generic Drugs. And we will also hear from Dr. Eleftheria Tsakalozou, a senior pharmacologist and acting team lead within the Division of Quantitative Methods and Modeling, also within the Office of Research and Standards within the Office of Generic Drugs. So please join me now in welcoming our first presenter.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for your interest in today's webinar on redesigned pre-submission meetings in GDUFA III, benefits for ANDA submission and approval. I'm Karen Bengtson, Supervisory Regulatory Health Project Manager in the Office of Research and Standards within the Office of Generic Drugs. In today's webinar, we'll focus on the changes and new features of pre-submission meetings under GDUFA III, as well as discuss how the redesigned scope and features may benefit preparation of your ANDA submission and its regulatory assessment post-submission. In this presentation, I will cover the different types of pre-ANDA meetings that are available, the change in purpose and scope of the pre-submission meetings, eligibility criteria as laid out in the GDUFA III commitment letter, a look at the differences between pre-submission meetings from GDUFA II to GDUFA III, discuss changes related to pre-submission meeting packages, provide an overview of the new meeting timeline, and lastly, what you can expect on the day of the pre-submission meeting. So the pre-ANDA program includes product development and pre-submission meetings, which are meant to facilitate communications between FDA and prospective applicants related to complex products and/or complicated drug development issues. Product development meetings are question-based meetings that provide a forum for scientific exchange on specific issues, such as a proposed study design, an alternative bioequivalence approach, or additional study expectations. FDA will provide targeted advice regarding your ongoing ANDA development program. Pre-submission meetings, which are the focus of today's webinar, are not meant to be question-based meetings, but provide an opportunity for prospective applicants to present to FDA the aspects of their upcoming ANDA submission that would be unique or novel. I'll take a moment to focus on two other meeting types that are available through pilot programs. These meetings are not GDUFA meetings. They are question-based meetings, and in some case, these meetings may be more suitable for your specific program needs. The first one is the FDA EMA Parallel Scientific Advice Pilot Program for complex products or hybrid products. The PSA program allows FDA and EMA assessors to concurrently exchange their views on scientific issues with prospective applicants during the development phase of complex generic drug or hybrid products. Through the PSA process, applicants will gain insight into the recommendations from both agencies. The Model Integrated Evidence Industry Meeting Pilot allows for focused interactions between industry and FDA on science-driven topics related to the model integrated approaches for establishing bioequivalence in generic drug development for both complex and non-complex products. You can obtain additional information on these pilot programs by referring to the general principle documents that can be found at the respective links at the bottom of this slide. So it's important to mention these types of question-based meetings that are available because it's recommended that you utilize these types of meetings to seek the agency's feedback during your ongoing development program as appropriate. FDA recommends that prospective ANDA applicants of a complex product seek FDA's input via a product development meeting prior to submitting a request for a pre-submission meeting. This will allow FDA to have the knowledge of the prospective ANDA's applicant's development program at the time of the pre-submission meeting. You can then utilize the pre-submission meeting as a touch point to share with FDA how you implemented the agency's advice and receive feedback on potential items that you would want to clarify or address before submission of your ANDA. So as mentioned, the purpose of this redesigned pre-submission meeting is now to provide an opportunity to present the unique or novel data or information that will be included in your ANDA submission. This includes formulation, key studies, justifications, methods used in product development, or the interrelationship of data and information in the ANDA. This is your opportunity to orient identified FDA assessors in preparation for the review of your upcoming ANDA submission, and FDA will provide feedback on items or information that should be clarified. It's not meant to provide a substantive assessment of summary data or full study reports, and is not an opportunity to determine whether the ANDA is acceptable for receipt. For example, prospective applicants should not request or expect guidance on whether certain components needed for receipt consideration may be omitted from the ANDA. So this table summarizes the differences between GDUFA II and GDUFA III. In addition to the purpose, I'll highlight a few other items on this table. First, pre-submission meetings under GDUFA III are offered as either in-person, face-to-face meetings or video conferences. This is because, based on the new scope, the meeting focuses on your presentation to the agency, and written response only option is not an offered format. Additionally, because there are no questions in the meeting, the agency may not have any preliminary comments to provide prior to the meeting. If this is the case, you'll be notified no later than 5 days prior to the scheduled meeting date. And unlike a product development meeting, receipt of preliminary comments should not result in cancellation of a meeting. I also want to note really quickly in this slide the changes with regard to the time frame, which we'll go into more detail in a subsequent slide, but just want to note that the shorter overall timeline of 60 days to hold the meeting is really to allow more timely feedback from the agency as you get ready to prepare your ANDA submission. So in GDUFA III commitment letter, FDA agreed to grant a pre-submission meeting if a prospective applicant was granted a prior product development meeting for the same complex product. So if you'd been granted a prior product development meeting for the same complex product in any format, whether it's in-person, face-to-face, video conference, teleconference, or written response only, it would meet that criteria for a will grant of a pre-submission meeting, assuming that the meeting request package are complete. In addition, if a prospective applicant cancels a prior product development meeting because they have received and are satisfied with FDA's preliminary response, it would also meet that criteria. However, FDA also agreed that they'll grant a pre-submission meeting when FDA believes in its sole discretion that a pre-submission meeting would improve the ANDA assessment efficiency. Prospective ANDA applicants can request a pre-submission meeting whether or not they've had a product development meeting. However, as mentioned previously, it's recommended that prospective ANDA applicants of complex products seek input through a product development meeting before submitting a request for a pre-submission meeting. So with the change in the scope, there's also change in what you should include in your meeting package. It's recommended that you thoroughly review the revised guidance for industry on formal meetings between FDA and ANDA applicants of complex products under GDUFA. The guidance will include the most complete information on suggested content and format of your meeting request and package. You'll find a link to the guidance at the bottom of this slide and also at the end of this presentation under resources. In general, high-level information is sufficient in your meeting package. However, if you haven't had a prior product development meeting, you may want to include additional information. In general, your meeting package should not include questions to the agency. As noted, the redesigned pre-submission is not meant to be a question-based meeting. What you should include in your meeting package is whether you've had a prior product development meeting. If you have, include the event IDs and also a summary of the advice that was provided during the meetings. If there have been no prior product development meetings, include the additional explanation of why a pre-submission meeting should be granted. Include the estimated timeline for submission of the ANDA and describe the unique or novel data or information that you'd like to discuss with the agency prior to your ANDA submission. Pre-submission meeting packages can also now be submitted in the form of a draft meeting presentation. Appendix B of the formal meeting guidance includes suggested presentation outline template listing items that prospective and applicants should consider including or addressing in their presentation. Some of the examples of the types of information include alternative bioequivalence study design to the PSG recommendation, novel in vitro drug release testing methods, new statistical methods used for supporting bioequivalence, novel or unique approaches to development, manufacture, or control strategies of the drug product, novel bioanalytical methods used in the in vivo bioequivalence study, or novel analytical methods used in the in vitro bioequivalence study, or if there are any design differences identified in the user interface of the proposed product compared to the reference listed drug. Just note that the appendix is not an exhaustive list, and there may be additional items that should be included based on your individual product development program. Note that draft presentations may be updated up to 21 days prior to the scheduled meeting date if you want your draft presentation to be considered in preliminary comments. Final presentations should be submitted at least 48 hours prior to your scheduled meeting date. So I want to quickly summarize the do's and don'ts for your meeting package. Do include information on the regulatory history, the prior interactions that you've had with the agency throughout your generic drug development, either through control correspondence or through product development meetings. Clearly indicate the unique or novel aspects of your prospective application that you'd like to give FDA assessors a heads up on, those aspects that may benefit from providing some additional background before the assessment of your application begins. Consider submitting your meeting package as your draft presentation. FDA may provide you feedback in the preliminary comments on additional clarification or items you should include in your presentation to have more meaningful meeting. Do not include specific questions. As mentioned, this is not a question-based meeting, so if you have questions that you'd like to seek the agency's feedback on, you should determine based on the questions you have the most appropriate pathway. You should refer to the guidances for control correspondence and formal meetings to help determine the appropriate pathway. So in this image, I want to highlight the changes to the pre-submission meeting timeline, and I'll also note what has not changed. So for GDUFA III, FDA agreed to grant or deny a meeting within 30 days of the FDA receipt date. During that time frame, FDA will identify ANDA assessment team members who will attend the pre-submission meeting, and in the grant letter, identify additional topics that the prospective applicant should address during the meeting when applicable. The grant letter will also include scheduling information for your meeting. If the meeting is going to be denied, the FDA will include the reason in the denial letter. Meetings will now be held within 60 days of the FDA receipt date, again allowing for more timely feedback from the agency. There were no changes to the timeline with regard to preliminary comments from GDUFA II to GDUFA III. Comments will be issued at least 5 days prior to the scheduled meetings, or you'll be notified, as mentioned previously, if there are no comments. After the meetings are held, applicants will have the option to submit their summary of the meeting discussion within 7 calendar days of the meeting date. FDA will issue the final and official meeting minutes within 30 days of the meeting being held, and in general, a pre-submission meeting should be requested about 6 to 8 months prior to your anticipated ANDA submission date. On the day of your meeting, what can you expect? So meetings are typically going to be 60 minutes in length. Your presentation will help orient and guide the discussion that occurs during the meeting. FDA attendees will include members of the ANDA assessment team and also participants in any prior product development meetings when applicable. At the meeting, again, FDA can ask questions regarding information in your meeting presentation and will not address questions regarding, for example, the acceptability for filing. FDA will identify those items or information that should be clarified before you submit your ANDA. So to summarize, GDUFA III Redesigned Pre-Submission Meeting will provide you with an opportunity to present to the identified ANDA assessment team members unique or novel data that's going to be included in your upcoming ANDA submission. FDA at the meeting will identify items or information that you should clarify before you submit your ANDA. If you have questions for the agency before you submit your ANDA, you can seek feedback through an appropriate pathway. That could either be a control correspondence or a pre-ANDA product development meeting. Lastly, here's a resource slide with some links to information that may be helpful to you. I just want to take a moment to say thank you for your time and attention, and I hope this presentation was helpful to you. The next presentation will be GDUFA III, Maximizing the Impact of the Redesigned Pre-Submission Meetings on Generic Approvals. I will be back for the Q&A portion at the end of this webinar. Thank you again.
Thank you, Karen, for the nice introductory presentation. Hello, everyone. My name is Wang. In the next hour, Dr. Eleftheria and I will further discuss how you can maximize the impact of the redesigned pre-submission meetings on generics approvals. Here's our standard disclaimer. Please note this presentation reflects the views of the author and should not be construed to represent FDA's views or policies. You have listened to Karen's presentation, which nicely outlines the general scope and considerations for pre-submission meeting requests. So in this presentation, we are going to further discuss why you may consider to request a pre-submission meeting if you are developing a complex generic product. How can you prepare a successful meeting package? And what are the potential outcomes of a pre-submission meeting request? What kind of feedback you may get throughout this process? So to help illustrate our points, we will discuss a few case examples, including product applied on the skin, such as topical semi-solid dosage forms, and orally inhaled drug products. At the end of the presentation, we also have a list of key messages that are hopefully useful for you to keep in mind during your ANDA development and preparation of your submission. So the first question to ask when you do anything is why? Why am I doing it? Right? We understand from generic industry standpoint, time is a critical factor throughout your development. And the purpose of PSUB ultimately is actually to help the overall timing of the ANDA approval. So why a PSUB can be beneficial? This can be viewed from both ends, right? From the FDA side, this PSUB meeting provides an opportunity for the prospective applicant to give a preview of complex issues in their ANDA submission to better prepare the FDA assessors who will review the ANDA when it is filed. So with a clear understanding of those complex issues, the reviewer can better start their assessment. So this preparation can go a long way during the actual assessment. Then, on the other hand, for generic applicants, FDA, although we say in pre-submission meeting, you should not ask questions because we're trying to keep the timeline in mind and make PSUB meeting with a shorter 60-day timeline to really have a conversation about the ANDA submission. So at that point, we don't expect you to have any unresolved technical issues, because at that point, at the point when you come in to meet with us as a PSUB, you should have already resolved those issues. At least from your standpoint, you think you have resolved it. So now what you want to do is you want to present those outcomes results to us, to educate us, and also to see if there are any major components are still missing or unaddressed. So those are the kind of feedback you could get, which I'll further elaborate in later slides and also in our case examples. Then ultimately, I think FDA and generic industrial applicants, we have the common goals. Is through pre-submission meeting, our purpose is to reduce potential major deficiencies. So we have a more streamlined review process that could ultimately reduce the timeline between submission and final approval. Let's move on to discuss the next question. The question on how. When should you request a PSUB meeting? What are the complex issues that can benefit from a PSUB meeting request? Here I have a few commonly seen categories, which are not intended to represent the complete list, but I hope they can give you a flavor of the type of issues that is worth considering a PSUB meeting request. The first category is new analytical methods and or orthogonal analytical approaches. The two examples I have here are drug products containing complex active pharmaceutical ingredient API and new novel manufacturing processes. So when you're generic submission is for a drug product that has complex API. The general expectation is that you should provide comparative characterization studies to support the API in your proposed test formulation is considered the same or highly similar to the reference product. Given the complexity of a complex drug substance, the conclusion on API sameness often require a panel of comparative characterization studies. In such case, the PSUB meeting can provide the applicant a good opportunity to present to the FDA if they have used any analytical methods that are not commonly seen, or simply to give the complete on face value list of their orthogonal approaches to get FDA's feedback on the completeness. Although the final acceptability for the method and the adequacy of the data, those are review issues. But in terms of the completeness of the studies, and those are the things FDA can potentially provide useful feedback based on their understanding of the product, past experiences, and current expectations. Moving on to the second category, which is alternative bioequivalence approach. The Office of Generic Drugs is committed to develop product-specific guidances to help generic industry design the scientifically sound and feasible bioequivalence studies. But that doesn't mean applicant cannot use alternative approaches as long as those are sufficiently justified. If an ANDA submission contains a BE study that is either completely different from the PSG's recommendation or has some deviations from the PSG, or maybe if the product is old, then there is no PSG, then it is helpful for the applicant to come meet the FDA, give us a heads up about what is on the way. If an in vitro performance and characterization test-based approach is used in lieu of a clinical BE study recommended in the PSG, for instance, then the PSUB meeting can be a good venue for the applicant to explain why they think the alternative in vitro approach is appropriate and can be sufficient. Another scenario for alternative BE is to utilize modeling and simulation M&S approach to reduce the burden from clinical BE side. I'm not going to discuss this particular example further here, as you will hear case studies from Dr. Eleftheria in the second part of this presentation. The last category I have here is new or complex study design, guidance implementation, or data analysis challenges. So the scenarios that could fit under this category include, but is not limited to, immunogenicity study design for peptide drugs, in vitro drug release testing, IVRT, and or in vitro permeation testing, IVPT, new novel statistical analysis of in vitro and or in vivo bioequivalence data, and comparative human factor studies for device evaluation. So regardless which category or what kind of complex issue you may have, the key consideration or the key message here is those issues are worth an open discussion between the generic applicant and the FDA, so everyone's understanding is aligned to move forward with the actual ANDA assessment. And that leads to the focus of the next slide, which will talk about what are the potential outcomes from PSUB. What are potential useful outcomes of pre-submission meeting requests? Like I have already mentioned, this has to be viewed from both the FDA end and the generic applicant's end. From the FDA's standpoint, a pre-submission meeting provides an opportunity for assessors to have a better understanding of the identified complex issues in a prospective ANDA submission. So they are prepared to look at those issues once they officially kick off the assessment cycle. This potentially can significantly increase the efficiency of the assessment because they have already obtained a correct baseline understanding and they are prepared to look into the right direction from the beginning point. Then from the ANDA applicant standpoint, there are multiple benefits. In case an applicant has had several regulatory inquiries, either controlled correspondences or pre-product development meeting requests, then the PSUB meeting is a place that you can show the FDA your final execution of those feedback to make sure your understanding of FDA's previous feedback is correct and implemented in the right way, so your ANDA has all the essential information to be considered complete to allow proper assessment in the first cycle. And another interesting thing I'm going to talk a little bit more in the next two slides is part of the redesign of PSUB is you could actually now require a pre-submission meeting when you are still wrapping up your program. As you heard in Karen's presentation, when we first introduced this type of meeting, our expectation is that when you request a PSUB, then you should be towards the end of your development, meaning you can foresee that your submission will be in within the next 6 months. But then throughout the process, based on what we have seen, and like I mentioned, we do recognize timing is a critical factor here. Then our updated thinking is that it's not necessary for you to actually present or the complete submission, because not every single component of your submission is going to be complex. So if you have identified complex issues and that particular issue or those issues are considered done at one stage, then you can also request a pre-submission meeting to get our feedback. The key difference or the subtle difference here compared to a pre-development meeting is we do not expect you to have still unaddressed technical questions here. So if you have already resolved technical questions and think you have done a complete study for a particular issue, then you can come meet with us. So the second benefit I have here, for instance, is if our PSG recommend a study that is complex and you have already done that portion, and now you would like to check with the FDA if your implementation of our recommendation is on the right track, you can come in to request a pre-submission meeting. So that is one particular example, but in general, the most obvious and biggest benefit is to get feedback from the FDA to facilitate your preparation of your final submission, to ensure the things that are needed to allow proper assessment are going to be in your end submission. We have seen cases applicants think they have done everything, but when they present the data or the methods, the information to us, we help them to spot things that are still missing. Those things are not necessarily something difficult to do. They did not have that portion simply because they did not know. That is part of our expectation. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to use a topical product to further elaborate this new aspect of when you may consider a pre-submission meeting and what could be the potential beneficial outcomes. In this slide, I'm going to use a topical gel as an example product to further elaborate our updated thinking on when a pre-submission meeting can be requested and what might be the reason to request a pre-submission meeting. So the hypothetical drug product here is a topical gel that contains two active ingredients, D and E. The PSG recommends that bioequivalence of a proposed test product can be established based on an in vitro characterization approach when the test product meets the no difference criteria with regard to formulation composition. When such criteria is met, then reference and test product sameness in physical, chemical, and structural attributes can be established by comparative characterization studies, and equivalence in vitro release of both D and E can be established using a properly validated in vitro drug release testing method. So what could be the challenges during implementation of the PSG? So there are two key components for the in vitro-based approach. For demonstrating sameness in physical, chemical, and structural attributes, new analytical methods may be needed for characterizing the particle size distribution of the two active ingredients suspended in the gel simultaneously. And ideally, the particle size of the active ingredients should be characterized when they are present in the formulation without the need to extract them out of the formulation. The potential challenge for developing an in vitro release testing method that can be used to demonstrate equivalent in vitro release of the active ingredients between test and reference products can arise from the method validation. In particular, what are the proper parameters to be evaluated to demonstrate selectivity of the developed in vitro release testing method? So those questions can be technically challenging, and it is beneficial if applicant wants to clearly articulate their rationale and study design for those studies to make sure FDA is on the same page with them and also get some constructive feedback prior to finalizing their development program. So in the next slide, I'm going to give a bit more detailed discussion on how the two potential challenges can be presented in a PSUB meeting request, and then what kind of feedback or outcomes can be throughout the process. To continue our previous discussion, let's see first, when a new analytical method for characterizing particle size distribution of the two active ingredients suspended in the gel is used, how a successful pre-submission meeting should be presented. So our expectation is that your request should clearly outline your strategy for developing and validating analytical method or methods that were used to simultaneously characterize the particle size distribution of two active ingredients suspended in the gel. Then from FDA's end, we will look at the information provided. When feasible or appropriate, FDA will clarify if additional data or data presentation may be helpful to facilitate the scientific assessment. This also gives the FDA an opportunity to raise some clarification questions to help better understand the whole method development and validation. Then in the case of developing or validating the in vitro drug release testing with regard to selectivity, our expectation is that you should clearly outline what approaches were utilized to validate the selectivity of your developed in vitro drug release testing method and the differences compared to method validation approach in general guidance for topical products. Then again, in terms of FDA's feedback, whenever feasible, FDA is willing to provide constructive feedback to clarify if additional, for instance, solubility and or release data may be helpful to facilitate the scientific assessment. So the key message here is once you have all studies complete for a particular complex issue, then a PSUB meeting can be requested. So you do not need to wait until the end of your development program. You can benefit from this open dialogue between you and the FDA to make sure the key complex component or components of your ANDA is done correctly, so you can move forward with potentially with more efficiency to prepare a submission with better quality. This concludes my part of the presentation. Next, I'm going to pass the floor to Dr. Eleftheria. She will continue discussing 2 case studies focusing on modeling and simulation analysis to complete this presentation.
Thank you, Yan. Hello, everyone. I would like to take this opportunity to discuss how applicants that are considering a modeling and simulation approach in their ANDA could utilize the PSUB meeting. Within the scope of the PSUB meeting, applicants can orient FDA assessors in preparation for review of their upcoming ANDA submission. It is possible that applicants have interacted with the agency in the past under a PDAV meeting or a Model Integrated Evidence meeting or an FDA EMA Parallel Scientific Advice Program meeting and received regulatory recommendations. It is advised that they include these recommendations in the PSUB meeting package. Any FDA recommendations that they have received through control correspondence is also advisable to be included in their PSUB meeting package. Importantly, unique or novel data or information that will be included in the prospective ANDA submission should also be highlighted in the PSUB meeting package. Placing of the modeling and simulation approach in ECTD can also be described and discussed under the PSUB meeting. Identification of the modeling approach, the data sets that support the approach, as well as the reports documenting the approach, can be discussed under the PSUB meeting. Usually, this analysis report is submitted under Module 531 or other relevant modules. The PSUB meeting is an excellent venue for applicants to discuss the proper documentation of their modeling and simulation approaches. Typically, modeling and simulation approaches support alternative bioequivalence approaches, and therefore their proper documentation is extremely important. The level of detail in the modeling analysis plan and the modeling analysis report should allow the agency to reproduce the analysis. This level of detail can be discussed during a PSUB meeting. In general, the role of the proposed model within an NDA should be clearly stated in the model analysis plan. Justifications and limitations should be clearly stated. The model development and validation process should be clearly described. The virtual bioequivalence assessment and its results should be clearly presented with interpretation, and the applicants are advised to include a type 1 and type 2 error analysis. Further discussion of these aspects of the modeling and simulation analysis can be discussed within the PSUB meeting. We do encourage applicants to include an orientation file in their ANDA submission when this submission includes a modeling and simulation approach. This orientation file would be essentially a list of version-controlled model files and supporting datasets, their sources, if these datasets can be generated by the applicant or pulled from the literature, as well as the role of the modeling and the supporting datasets in the ANDA. This orientation file can be presented within the scope of a PSUB meeting and discussed further. The orientation file would include model files that are developed to support the modeling and simulation approach, datasets utilized in the modeling and simulation approach. It is important that they are clearly identified in the submission and their relationship with studies that are supporting the ANDA submission is clearly described. And finally, the orientation file could include literature or other sources of information that support the modeling and simulation approach. Applicants may utilize the PSUB meeting to orient FDA assessors on the data that has been utilized to support the modeling and simulation approach, as well as the role of that data in the regulatory submission. It is important for FDA assessors to be aware of whether the data has been generated by the applicant within the scope of the ANDA, or if the applicant is including in their submission relevant data sets that are provided but have not been generated within the scope of ANDA. Protocols, study reports referring to the datasets utilized, as well as analysis that has been performed, is important information when describing a dataset and therefore when building a model under certain assumptions. Very often, modeling and simulation approaches are supported by data that include information from literature sources. It is important that applicants introduce those literature sources to the FDA assessors for feedback. Questions regarding the filing acceptability of the modeling and simulation approach in an ANDA are outside the scope of a PSUB meeting. Additionally, the overall acceptability of an alternative bioequivalence approach, if applicable, is outside the scope of the PSUB meeting. Finally, substantive assessment of any part of the ANDA will not take place within the scope of a PSUB meeting. However, the FDA will identify items or information that should be clarified before submission of an ANDA. And the FDA is committed to a productive exchange during the PSUB meeting. To illustrate how the PSUB meeting can be utilized by applicants that are considering a modeling and simulation approach supporting their prospective ANDA, we have developed two hypothetical examples. The first example refers to an active ingredient Y orally inhaled drug product. For this hypothetical product, the recommendations of the agency involve a combination of in vitro and in vivo BE studies. The applicants are expected to show qualitative and quantitative sameness between the RLD and the test product, device similarity, and multiple in vitro tests. These tests are supplemented by an in vivo pharmacokinetic study in fasting conditions for both strengths of the orally inhaled drug product with healthy volunteers. The PSG recommendations also include an in vivo comparative clinical endpoint or pharmacodynamic study in patients. The applicant's alternative B approach also involves a combination of in vitro and in vivo B studies. The applicant is proposing to show Q1 and Q2 sameness between the RLD and the test product, device similarity, and B through in vitro testing. The applicant is also proposing to conduct an in vivo PK study in fasting conditions for both strengths in healthy volunteers. However, instead of conducting the in vivo comparative clinical endpoint study, the applicant is proposing alternative in vitro and in silico studies, including an in silico regional deposition model. Under this scenario, the applicant can use the PSUB meeting to ensure that critical components of the modeling and simulation approach within the alternative B approach they are proposing are accurately captured in their ANDA submission. For instance, they can use the PSUB meeting to make sure that the context of use for their proposed model in the alternative approach is clearly described. They can use the PSUB meeting to navigate the FDA assessors through the data that were generated by the applicant within the scope of the ANDA. These datasets could include aerodynamic particle size distribution data with realistic mouth-throat models, dissolution data, plumb geometry data, in vivo PK data, and other datasets. Relevant datasets, protocols, study reports that refer and describe the datasets that I just mentioned, as well as relevant analysis and literature sources could also be discussed within the scope of a PSUB meeting. Applicants may use the PSUB meeting to ensure that all the information regarding the validation of their proposed model for its intended purpose will be included in their prospective ANDA submission. The validation of the proposed model may include in vivo nuclear imaging data, gamma scintigraphy, single photon emission computer tomography and computed tomography, and positron emission tomography studies. Other observed data on systemic PK of the active ingredient Y in the orally inhaled drug product of interest, such as the pilot study and literature sources, could also be listed in the PSUB meeting request. Validation of the computational framework utilized for building the model, if applicable, is also an important component of the documentation regarding the validation of the model. Finally, it is extremely important within an alternative bioequivalence approach to apply the model for its intended purpose, which in this case is assessing regional drug delivery. It is important that the virtual bioequivalence assessment study, in terms of its design, the virtual healthy or asthmatic patients, and the statistical analysis is properly documented. The model can also be used to establish biorelevant limits for bioequivalence comparison of key recommended studies for B establishment, and all of these discussions are within the scope of the PSUB meeting, and more specifically their proper documentation as the submission of the ANDA is planned. The second modeling and simulation example, third example for this presentation, is an example of the active ingredient Y topical cream. For this hypothetical example, the PSG recommendations involve an in vitro characterization approach combined with an in vivo B study with PK endpoints in healthy volunteers. Under the in vitro characterization approach, the test product is expected to meet the no difference criterion in regard to when compared to the RLD. Test and reference sameness in physical, chemical, and structural attributes should be demonstrated. Equivalent in vitro release of the active ingredient Y between the reference and the test, and equivalent rate and extent of Y permeation through excised human skin between the reference and the test are expected to be demonstrated. However, the applicant here is proposing an alternative bioequivalence approach, which is also a combination of in vitro characterization data studies as well as an in vivo BE study with peak endpoints in healthy volunteers. The difference on the in vitro characterization approach between the PSG recommended studies and the alternative B approach proposed by the applicant is that the applicant proposes not to conduct a pivotal IVPT study. Instead, they are proposing an in silico pivotal IVPT study. Under this hypothetical example, the applicant has interacted with the agency in the past, potentially through a PDEV meeting, where they have received feedback in regards to multiple aspects of their alternative bioequivalence approach. In the PSUB meeting package, they are summarizing previous meeting outcomes that may include the pilot IVPT study, which demonstrated high interdonor variability. For that case, the applicant was advised to increase the number of donors. The applicant may have encountered challenges regarding their analytical methodology for the active ingredient Y, and they were advised to increase the sensitivity of their method. The applicant may have also encountered challenges in showing the discriminatory capability of their IVPT methodology. Therefore, they were advised to explore several applied product amounts per the FDA guidances, the PSG, as well as general guidances. The applicant may have also received in previous pre-NDAs feedback on their in silico IVPT model. It is possible that this model was over-predicting or under-predicting the API skin permeation and not capturing the interdonor variability observed in the pilot IVPT study. Within the scope of the previous PDEV meeting, the applicant was advised to validate their IVPT methodology and increase the number of donors and replicates as explained above to ensure that the future model refinement that would be performed against reliable IVPT data. Against this background, the applicant may come in with a new PSUB meeting request now and leverage that PSUB meeting to ensure that the IVPT study issues that were identified previously have been addressed. The number of donors, the bioanalytical methodology validation, the applied drug product doses, all the steps that the applicant had taken towards resolving these issues are properly now documented in their prospective ANDA submission. Additionally, an important part of their alternative B approach was the in silico IVPT study. So the applicant can use the PSUB meeting to orient FDA assessors on the data that was utilized to support the modeling and simulation approach and their role in this regulatory submission. In vitro characterization data, pilot IVPT study data for model validation, as well as the in vivo PK data are all important components of the model development and validation process that should be clearly documented. So this can be discussed within the scope of a PSUB meeting. More specifically, the applicant can use the PSUB meeting to make sure that certain aspects of their modeling and simulation approach is appropriately documented. In this case, the applicant is proposing an in silico IVPT study instead of the pivotal IVPT study. So the role of the proposed model needs to be clearly documented and described. It is important to validate the proposed model for its intended purpose. So pilot IVPT data, study data that were generated under this ANDA or other IVPT data sets available in the literature or provided by the applicant should be included in the ANDA submission. Validation of the computational framework utilized for building the in silico IVPT model should also be included. Finally, the design of the IVPT study, the virtual population, number of donors, and replicates the statistical analysis of the simulated results, and type 1 and 2 error analysis, if applicable, should also be properly documented and described in the ANDA submission. All of these components can be discussed within the scope of a PSUB meeting. In concluding this presentation, I would like to leave you with some take-home messages. Focus your meeting package on describing principal areas of interest. When developing your PSUB meeting package, please use the presentation format that is provided in the guidance. The link to the guidance is at the bottom of the slide. In your meeting package, make sure to highlight any novel, unique data and approaches that are relevant to your ANDA submission. A PSUB meeting can be requested when all studies are complete for the identified complex issues that are relevant to your ANDA. Thank you very much for your attention. Jan and I will be happy to take your questions during the Q&A session.
Welcome, everyone. I hope you all enjoy the presentations. Welcome to our live session now for the panel discussion on pre-submission meeting. I'm Wang. I will be the moderator for today's panel, and I would like to invite our panelists to connect, turn on their camera, unmute your mic. So today we have assembled a diverse group of experts from differing perspectives and experiences to further discuss this exciting topic on the redesign of a pre-submission meeting, to explore what are the opportunities surrounding this pre-submitting meeting requests in the next 35 minutes. Please join me welcome our panelists. We have Dr. Paula Simomora, Division Director from the Division of Product Quality Assessment, Office of Pharmaceutical Quality. Dr. Partha Roy, Director, Office of Bioequivalence in Office of Generic Drugs. Dr. William Chang, Director in the Office of Safety and Clinical Evaluation in OGD. And Dr. Robert Leinberger, Director in the Office of Research and Standards in OGD. With that, I see our panel. I think we are still missing Rob. While we're waiting for Rob to join us, I think we can move on to kick off our panel discussion with the first topic. So the first one, to continue our presentations, I think we have heard already some feedback, initial discussion on why a pre-submission meeting request should be considered by generic applicants. So here we would like to continue the discussion and get each of yours input from your standpoint. what may be the values to request a pre-submission meeting. So with that, maybe Pahala, if you'd like to kick off the discussion.
Jan, thank you so much. Perspective from the assessment office, I would say valuable because the fact we even before the that during this piece meeting, then we would learn this, and then so on and so. Yes,
Excuse me, Pahala, sorry to interrupt, but your audio is breaking up, so maybe we have to reconnect a bit.
Here.
In the meanwhile,
okay.
Is still breaking up. In the meanwhile,
can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
Jan?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay. For the glade, what I was saying is, I think this that to be submitted, we or even industry would share what's going on, issue challenge, you discuss your gel.
Yeah.
And then from the applicant perspective, they would get.
Greetings all. Apologies for interruptions. We seem to be encountering some technical difficulties. Pahala, if you would like to go back onto mute, we will work with you. And Jan, why don't you take that question to somebody else? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, sorry about that. But let's move on to the next panelist while Pahala is reconnecting his devices. So next, maybe Partha, if you'd like to comment from your standpoint.
Okay, just want to make sure that you can hear me, right?
Yes, very well.
Okay, that's great. That's great. Thank you. Yeah, so I think there is quite a bit of value for have a pre-submission meeting. So the way I like to think about this is an opportunity. Actually, you'll be in front of the review team. That the review team, you're going to encounter, once the application is in house, right? So this is a sort of a great opportunity to orient the review team. So it's a sort of the way I think about it, it's more like an application orientation meeting. You can also call a review awareness meeting where you can just go and talk to the reviewer that, hey, these are the different aspects of the application, where they are, how many, study reports you have submitted. Because oftentimes there are times when you have multiple, so for example, bioequivalent study reports, and you have done many of the studies, in this application, but also you might have done studies elsewhere and you wanted to submit that and you want to tie all of that together. Oftentimes the review team maybe sometimes struggles, which is sort of the pivotal study and how the other studies, the study results should actually inform our decision making. So this is a great opportunity to kind of tell in your own words. I mean, I know you have already, you're probably going to submit all of the information and that will be your package. But this is a way to kind of tell the review team, this is your package. And from your perspective, why something that you already put in the package is important. I mean, within the application, maybe the review team have a different opinion, and that's fine. But at least from your perspective, what you think is going to be absolutely important and how you're connecting all of the dots. A lot of times we see that you have a pre-development meeting where you discussed a certain path and you got a FDA response, and then we see that maybe you have not exactly adapted to all of the responses or recommendations that we provided. Maybe something is missing. It's not really missing, but you probably thought that is the information that you already have may be able to inform the question that we have. So you may not have done that particular study, or you might have done a different study. So this is a way to kind of orient the assessment team. And I know there are a lot of times, questions is, oh, if I'm not being able to ask questions, so why is it valuable to me? But again, I think the way I look at it is that the review team, I mean, we have a philosophy that, if we see something, say something. So it means if we can tolerate your approach, that's a great starting point, I think. And the review team probably know exactly, how they would, review and come up with some kind of an internal strategy. So if we see that, okay, something is absolutely not going to be acceptable, we will probably say or provide some opinion around it. But that doesn't mean that the review is complete, because we probably also have a caveat language there. Ultimately, the data is going to drive our final decision, in the ANDA application. So I'll stop there. And I know there are other aspects of the discussion, but thank you.
Thank you, Partha, and welcome back, Pahala.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, very well.
All right. Thank you. I apologize for the me to it, but I just want to, because I'm from the quality assessment, exactly like, to know.
Pahala.
Apologize.
Yep, for some reason it's still breaking up.
Still breaking up.
Yep, now temporary is good.
Really?
Let's try again.
Anyway, what part I explained. So from the assessment perspective, obviously, kind of like the communication, early discussion, especially for complexity.
Yes, sorry, Pahala. I think we can capture what you are trying to say, but your audio is still breaking up. So Jeff, if the team could try to see if anything can be done behind the scene. And in the meanwhile, maybe we can move on to Bill, if you have anything to add, and then Rob.
Yeah, thanks. Hopefully my audio is okay.
Yes.
Okay. I mean, I think Partha covered a lot of it. I think the advantages of the pre-sub, I look at it as it's a way to get a preview. It's a way for us to get a preview of what the proposal to bioequivalence looks like, what the data look like. And it's a way for applicants to get a preview of any initial questions that we might have. And I think there's some advantages to getting that so that you can get a head start on either generating more rationale or justification for something that you can anticipate a question on. There's an opportunity for us to start kind of organizing the information and think about, hey, this is maybe where we'll want to do it, and gives us an opportunity to be a little bit more efficient when the ANDA does come in to start tackling things. I think Eleftheria provided a really good example of where the value is. If you have something that doesn't really fit well in sort of where the standard ECTD modules are, and you're trying to figure out where to put it, if you don't know where to put it, we probably won't know where to look for it. And so it's a nice opportunity to align on, hey, we have this new thing. It doesn't fit nicely. Let's align on where you should submit that so that when it comes in, we know where to look for it, so that we're not spending time looking for it. You're not getting questions about where is this information, and then you have to go find it and show us where it is. So that's just like another benefit that I see that wasn't really on something that Partha touched on. But yeah, I think this is an opportunity for us both to get a preview of what's coming in, what questions we might have, so that we can all get a head start on working through the ANDA submission and the data to ideally get us to an approval. Thank you.
Thank you. And Rob, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jan. So again, what's the value of this process? I mean, the reason it's in our commitment letter is in the negotiation process, we try to identify things that would help make the review of your applications more efficient by having more interactions with FDA. So this is something that I think industry said was important to them. And I think that's the value creation for this, is to make the review of your application more efficient, right? To get more interaction ahead of time. And I think it's a little bit confusing perhaps because, a lot of FDA meetings are question-based. Oh, send FDA the questions and get your answers. This is a little bit different concept to try to get a much faster timeline. So, one thing we heard during the negotiations also was we want faster feedback. We don't want to delay sending in a submission for waiting for answers to questions or have different meetings. So we said, how can we make this meeting as fast as possible and provide value that helps make the review more efficient? And that's why it's structured the way that it is. So it's a little bit new. That's why we're having this webinar, to really go through with potential submitters of these type of meetings to understand what the purpose is. But the value is that if you get this clarity, right, and FDA says, well, look, this is what you said you're going to do, you need to sort of provide some justification for this. You can provide that in your application. You can be prepared for that. And then that's sort of getting ahead of the review cycle. It's also an opportunity for you, the industry, to provide the review team the framing for how you want them to look at your application, how it fits together. And I think that could be an extremely valuable part of getting the product approved more quickly, rather than, reviewers look at your application, they ask questions, you send them back responses. You don't get an opportunity in that type of system to explain what you're doing and why you're doing it. And this is that opportunity. So I really encourage applicants to, take this and we need data to sort of show if this is valuable. If it's really valuable, then I think more people will use it, but we need people to participate in the program so that we can really evaluate how much more efficient and what elements are really most effective. So, that's the value-driven direction here, is how do we make the application review of these complicated situations more efficient?
Thank you, Rob. And welcome again, Paula. Great timing. If you could try to provide your...
Yes, can you hear me now?
We seem to still have the same issue for some reason.
Can you hear me?
I think we...
Can you hear me now?
Yes, this sentence is very clear, was very clear. Yeah, it seems like it's getting better.
It's okay. The next one, because it's already covered by, by already.
I'm sorry for this technical difficulty. Let's move on to our next topic. But here, if I may just quickly recap what was discussed, I think from logistics standpoint, this could provide a good opportunity for the applicant to clarify if you have confusion on how to construct your submission in terms of the location of the data. Then this could be a good opportunity for you to clarify that with the FDA to make sure we're on the same page and know where to look for critical information when the NDA is submitted. But then from the technical standpoint for scientific assessment, then this pre-submission meeting would give you the venue to explain to us how you did your study and why you did it in such a way. So FDA assessors have a good baseline understanding to kick off their scientific assessment. So with that, I think we can move on to the next topic to further get into the process to get everyone's input in terms of if you expect to receive a pre-submission meeting, then in your mind, how a successful meeting package or request should look like, what would be the information to be included. There could be different scenarios, right? Like we discussed, some applicant may already have prior communications, while different inquiries, either controlled correspondences or pre-development meetings with us, then they could take the submission meeting as a final step prior to their official submission, or there are some cases they may not have had that prior communication. And in such case, when you think that could be a good case, to request the PSUB, but that also sort of dives into the next aspect. So let's just focus on what you expect to see in a pre-submission meeting to be a good request. So with that, if Pasta, you want to take the initial discussion.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So I think there are obviously applicants who probably had a pre-development meeting, and I'm sure a lot of the applicants have control correspondence. So one of the things that we would be looking for within the pre-sub meeting is sort of connecting the dots from all of the regulatory interactions that you already have. So because sometimes the regulatory interactions happen a lot ahead of your actual ANDA application, right? So sometimes what happens is, the review teams probably have changed, and sometimes the information that you have after that meeting, is different. So I think it will be very useful for you to put that regulatory history and connect the dots about not only the approach that you have taken, but also some of the key data and the key results that you already obtained. So that will be a good good process to follow. Separately, also, you have, I think, in one of the presentations we presented, I think Karen presented, or the template that we have for the pre-submission meeting, which I think is a very good, sort of a template to follow and provide that information. So don't think more. I mean, I would like to think more as a story. So I mean, if you're telling a good story about your data and the results, I think that will be very helpful. Again, this is only going to be like within very short time that we have to provide that, get the package and also sort of react to the meeting and participate in that meeting. So there is obviously not a lot of time for a substantive review. You have probably heard that at least multiple times today. But definitely something that we would scan through and make sure that we understand the package very well from you, starting from the day one when you started the development program and all of the different interactions that we have, so that we understand exactly what is coming in. Because that also, in some way, actually, it also helps us sometimes to develop a review strategy in terms of who would we want to bring into the review, and who would we consult to. So that definitely helps us, set up in some form. And that's why I think, even the timing of this particular meeting is within 6 to 8 months. We don't want this meeting to be 2 years before, but also not going to be, like 30 days before the application. So that way, it's sort of a sweet time, probably around, maybe 6 months and ahead of your application. That becomes very helpful for us in terms of, going into the review. Thank you.
Thank you, Prasad. And Bill, if you have anything to elaborate from your standpoint.
Yeah. Thanks, Yan. I think from my perspective, a lot of this is really trying to be clear upfront on what is the unusual sort of thing, the complicated thing that we need to be aware of in the package. So I think, like Partha said, if you've had prior interactions with us, definitely let us know what those discussions were, and if there's something that veered off of the advice, flag that so that we know if you had challenges with addressing any suggestions we have in the pre-ANDA space. I think in the situation where you've not met with us before, I would say really being clear upfront, concise as much as possible, so that when we start looking at either a presentation deck that you're proposing as the backgrounder or other things, that we know where you're doing something that maybe is a little unusual or different or doesn't align with what our product-specific guidances have recommended or those sorts of things, so that we can start focusing our initial review on like, okay, these are the things that we might have questions on, so we can provide you the best and most efficient feedback on the areas where we think you'll need to provide more clarification, more justification, focus on those things. So I think really being clear up front on where you're a little bit off the usual path, or where the ANDA development has done something sort of novel, unusual that we should really be thinking about. I think that's where it'll help us kind of be able to focus and give the application submitter the best advice on what kinds of questions we might have when we get the ANDA into assessment. So I think those are just my thoughts on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. And Rob, I think your office at the front line for assessing the initial meeting requests. So if you could discuss maybe some past examples that you see which was not so successful, in addition to, in your mind, what may be the successful package?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges of being successful here is understanding like what makes this meeting process different than sort of many of the other FDA meetings, right? Again, it's not the question-based meetings. I feel like that's just a lot of the things that we see is people just want to, I'm meeting with FDA, I got to send them a list of questions. And this is a little bit different format there. So I think that's sort of key aspect of the preparation for it. And I think the other challenge that I think we've seen is, again, the idea is that this is pre-submission. It's not, it's not sort of like what studies to do. It's really like you've sort of made your decision to submit the application. You're not asking like what studies you should do, right? It's really getting input on what you intend to submit. And a lot of times I think we see people say, well, I want a pre-submission meetings. And then I have a question about what studies should I do? Because I'm going to, it is before the submission, but we have other meetings and other mechanisms like the product development meeting and the control correspondence to get inputs on what studies to do. So I think number one thing to be successful is recognize like how this fits into the life cycle of the other meetings, right? This is not what to do. This is getting input on what you did and how to explain it. And much more focused on preparation for the review of the application than deciding what sort of data is going to support your bioequivalence approach. We have a lot of other meetings and interaction sites for that. So I see really understand how this fits into the development program, and set in the timeline for. We've tried to make this meeting as fast as possible. So and thinking about the timeline before you submit it. We think it's most useful in that sort of last 6 months before submission, right? But you do want to leave a little bit of time after you have the meeting before your planned submission date. So if you say, well, look, I want to add this information in because FDA is going to ask for it, you have time to do that. So that's why I say like this, the 6 month time frame or so is close to it. And I think part of it is, understanding we don't expect the submission to be complete at the time of the pre-submission meeting, right? Because if your submission was complete, like every ANDA applicant is going to send in their submission when it's complete. Nobody's going to say, well, I'm going to stop with my complete submission. So I think to be successful in this, in the realities of the generic industry, right, you have to sort of have a plan for when you're going to submit this meeting. You don't have to have your submission complete when you submit it. You have to know what you're going to submit. The studies can be in progress. The stability data can be still running out. And, you have some thing that drives your timeline. But figure out how this works. So we're trying to be as flexible as possible, making this a very fast meeting to come in and get input in. So I think those are the elements that I think will make this successful, is really recognizing how this is different than other meetings and trying to take advantage of its unique features, the higher speed of interaction, and fit that into your development program so it doesn't slow anything down. That's not really the intention of anything that FDA or OG is trying to do with our processes around generic drug development. We want to help you get high quality products on the market, and by providing as clear advice as we can. So we're not trying to delay anything, but we're really trying to come up with processes and systems that do this in the most efficient way possible.
Thank you, Rob. I think in the remaining 7 minutes, we can move on to the last topic. I think Eleftheria's presentation gave already two very nice examples to illustrate what may be the potential topics, and I also mentioned a few topics at high level in my presentation. So here, I want to see from like Partha for bioequivalence, Bill for maybe clinical endpoint study or other aspect device for combination product, and Bob for just in general complex products. If you have anything additional, like potential topics, you think that may benefit from requesting a pre-submission meeting. So we can keep the same sequence, Partha, if you would like to.
Yeah, sure. I think we kind of touched upon many of these topics, and of course, Eleftheria and you also touched upon many of these topics. But again, I think we'll go back and say sometimes one is sort of the completeness of reports. I mean, and where the location of these reports are within the application, that becomes important. So the topics could be even statistical analysis, probably. If you have doing a sort of a alternate analysis, or you have done an additional analysis, which would ultimately support the what you are trying to support within the study. That would be important to kind of understand, because sometimes you go to the application, you say, oh, in the protocol, this is the primary analysis, but it looks like they have done also a bunch of other analysis, but I don't know how this will all inform to my decision making and what is the importance of those, right? Maybe you have sliced and diced the data differently to make a point, or provide some supporting information. So those type of things would be something that you are not going to give all the data and let us review within this meeting, but at least tell that this is sort of the intent, and this is, you can almost tell the review team, probably the review team can focus on this aspect. This is the intent of doing this. So that kind of story, I think it's important for us to hear. And also, these topics ultimately also help the review team, so that, oftentimes, we don't send an information request because sometimes we just don't understand exactly when, the data or how the data has been presented. So if we already know that really helps us to answer those questions quickly, or actually send you an information request which is much more targeted and not a very general type request. Just submit all the data. It's not like that. Rather, I will probe the data in a certain way. So those are certainly the topics which are important. And as I said, it is for the FDA. It's important to kind of understand, what are the different topics that we talked about, and how this is going to ultimately shape up in the ANDA application. I think that part is going to be important. One more thing, just the last thing. A lot of the times, a lot of the in vitro approaches, you have the validation reports, and a validation becomes an important issue. So sometimes you may have cross-validated, or you might have done a partial validation on certain aspects of it. And so those are important information. If we can grasp it even before we can get the application, I think that is helpful, again, for the review team, and that will really help also accelerate and clarify some of these information requests which may be already answered when we start looking and opening your package during the ANDA review. Thank you.
Thank you, Partha. And Bill, if you could discuss this from your experiences.
Sure. Thanks, Yan. Partha is a hard act to follow. He's got a lot of good thoughts. I think the first thing that I thought of was, if there are alternative statistical analyses that people are doing, that's certainly one where we want to think about the appropriateness and sort of populations and things. The other thing that I thought of that could be a good topic, and I don't know if this comes up all that much, but there are some times where we see imbalances in adverse events for whatever reason that doesn't favor the proposed generic drug, flagging those and explaining why that's not a concern, why it's not something we should be concerned about, can be helpful. And if there's additional information that we might ask for to help convince us that like there's really not a reason to be concerned, I think that's something that where we could see a benefit, and potentially the applicant as well, because if we have to ask fewer questions, that means it's less time that they have to spend doing things, digging through old case report form, pulling EKGs, that kind of thing, and then we can ideally kind of resolve that concern or question more quickly. I think those are the two that first came to mind as potential topics where we could see a benefit, just in terms of things that my office looks at when we're involved in the ANDA review. If I think of anything else, I'll chime in later, but maybe I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. And Rob?
Yeah, I mean, I think things that can really benefit from this are ones that are outside the scope of the usual ANDA submissions, right? So, OGD operates, approximately, a system that works at a pretty big scale, nearly 1,000 applications a year is the sort of magnitude. And but most of those applications follow certain patterns, right? Either they're solution injectables or they're solid oral products with PK/BE studies that are pretty standard. So the things I think that can benefit from this are ones that are sort of unusual. They're not reviewed that often, or it's something novel, like things that touch on immunogenicity, right? We've noticed a lot of interest in peptide drugs recently for obvious reasons, right? But there's a lot of opportunities there and we've seen a lot of cycles of deficiencies around evaluating the immunogenicity risk. And it's, that's a place where it might be good to sort of try to set up, here's what I'm doing and why, and how it's connected to other products. Other ones are drug device combination products where you have differences between your product and the brand product. And, if you read our guidances carefully, it's okay to have differences, right? But sometimes we're going to ask questions and try to evaluate those. And, explaining your rationale for why the differences are okay are very helpful. This can be helpful for things, both justifications that don't involve human factor studies. And, certainly if you are doing, after consulting with FDA through our other meetings, doing a human factor study, right? Bringing that, presenting that, saying, what did you do? What design decisions did you make? You can get input on things that FDA might ask you to provide supporting information for. So I think, those are a few topics. I know, in the talks today, you heard a little bit about topical products, and, although I think we think the reviews are getting, more efficient as we've seen more submissions, but some of the in vitro permeation tests for topical products, there's been, those are sort of relatively new, sometimes more difficult studies to do, that it might be helpful to say, here's what I did, here's how I sort of set up my method correctly, here are some of the decisions I made and the data that might support them. Like those type of inputs might make the review of those go through a little bit more smoothly. So those are the kinds of things we're looking for. Again, complex products where the studies that you're submitting in your application aren't the normal things that come in the application. And in all of those new cases, no matter how much guidance FDA writes, there's always going to be ambiguity in things and implementation decisions that the industry, as the pharmaceutical scientists on your team have to make decisions on how they actually do something. FDA is never going to give you a step-by-step guidance that gives you every detail of every protocol decision that you have to make. So in any of these cases, there's always sort of decisions that you have to make. Our guidances don't outline all of them because there's probably many correct answers to some of those, but the reviewers in their due diligence, right, are going to look and say, well, this is a new study. Why did you make this choice versus that choice? Do you have any data that supports it? That can help them as part of their review process in places where, again, for more complex situations where there's not really well-established methods to do it. Like, some of the more complicated analytical methods, might not have a USP general chapter that tells you sort of how to do it. So there's lots of decisions that you have to make on implementation of method. Like, we've approved multiple products now using the the chemical imaging, the MDRS method for nasal sprays, right? But those initial applications were very challenging for FDA to review. I said, well, what's the important part of showing that this method is working? This is the first applicant that used it. We did actually, approve those products, but if you had this type of mechanism in place, maybe you could have gotten feedback earlier and the review could have gone even faster for those products. So again, when you're using novel things that haven't really been used anymore, there's a lot of value in helping to explain to the FDA review staff what you're doing. That also gives them some time to go back and say, oh, someone's actually really going to submit this MDRS thing. Let me go talk to the people in the lab who've been practicing with this. In the few months before you submit your application, those reviewers might get, a seminar from someone in FDA's lab who's been using that method, and now they're familiar with it. If they didn't know you were going to submit that application, they're not going to go out and do that and prepare in that way. They're going to get your application and say, well, all right, please explain this, please explain that. And, so again, the area of the topics are really things that are novel, new, not normally found in application reviews. This is where I think there can be the most benefit from this new process.
Thank you, Rob. And thanks everyone again. If there are no further comments from anyone, I would like to thank you all the panelists for the insightful thoughts, and I'll turn it over to Nora to start the Q&A session. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you again to our presenters and panelists for their excellent presentations and insights. We'll welcome all of them back now to begin our question and answer panel. If you haven't had a chance to enter your question into the Q&A chat pod, please do so now. And we'll go ahead and see our questions coming in. First question looks like it's for Karen. Karen, in your presentation, you referred that pre-submission meetings are not question-based meetings. Could you please clarify, for example, as per slide number 6, which includes clarification regarding novel justifications, would that or any other such request for clarification constitute a question?
So thank you for the question. So pre-submission means that we've spent a lot of time focusing on that these are not question-based meetings, but indirectly you're asking a question through your presentation to the agency saying, this is what I'm planning to do. This is in my presentation. The FDA assessors that are at the meeting can say, we want you to clarify these additional items before you submit. So this is your chance to indirectly ask the question, what does FDA see that I should address before I submit my ANDA submission? Hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you for that response. Karen, we actually have another question that came in for you. Could you share examples of the most frequent or common reasons or basis for which the pre-submission meeting requests are denied?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, so the most common examples that we've seen since GDUFA III is that the meeting requests don't fit within the scope of the redesigned pre-submission meetings. So they're either specifically asking questions or in most cases even asking for a written response only, which as you know is not a format for this type of meeting, which would be focused around your presentation to the agency. So those types of questions, should be addressed before you get to a pre-submission meeting. And that's really the most common reason that we've seen in GDUFA III for denial. However, if your product was not complex or you hadn't had a prior product development meeting and the FDA in its discretion doesn't think that this would improve the ANDA review efficiency, then that may also be a reason for denial. Thank you.
All right, thank you again for that response. We now have a question for Jan. Could you elaborate how a pre-sub meeting would help in overall expediting or ensuring timely approval of an ANDA within the GDUFA goal date?
Thank you for that question. So here, I think as we discussed in the presentations as well as in our panel discussion, one of the biggest benefits of having a PSUB meeting is be able to have an opportunity to educate FDA assessors to prepare them to start the substantive scientific review. So this preparation can go a long way during assessment because then they are prepared and know how to look for the right information. And from your applicant's end, then this also can give them an opportunity to make sure the essential informations that are expected to be included in an ANDA submission indeed will be submitted to allow efficient, proper assessment. So that's what we mean by having a PSUB meeting can really benefit the overall efficiency of ANDA assessment, ultimately which could lead to a more timely approval. Thank you.
Thank you for that response, Dan. We have another question that came in for you. In most instances, for a pre-development meeting or pre-submission meeting, the common response is that the clarification sought or the study protocol shared or the study data shared is a matter of ANDA review. In such a situation, could you please clarify how these meetings would be helpful for a prospective applicant?
Thank you for that question. So here, it is true. In some cases, we always say if you actually ask a question on the adequacy or acceptability of your data or the proposed specifications, for instance, those are final assessment issue which cannot be predetermined prior to the ANDA submission. So I think that actually comes down to applicants knowing how to formulate the right questions to get the most helpful feedback. So what we can do in pre-submission stage is we can let you know your overall understanding of our expectations for a particular topic is on the right track, and your proposed strategy, either method validation development or overall how you propose to look at a complex issue, those things at a high level appears to be reasonable. Therefore, your data has a good chance to be on the right track for the assessment. So I think it's very critical when those meetings allows technical questions, applicants know how to raise a proper question. But then in the PSUB, like we discussed, technical questions should not be raised. But then during our meeting, we can still provide feedback on the general direction and the overall completeness of the proposed potential ANDA or the particular studies. Thank you.
Right. Thanks again, Jan. Appreciate your response. Now we have a question that came in for Eleftheria. Eleftheria, in case the RLD or RS is withdrawn from the market and no other generics are available, say the RS can't be assigned, we have failed BE study under fasting condition and comparative dissolution, and we need to modify our formula and proceed in the project. But we can't repeat the BE study versus RLD due to RLD non-availability. How can we show bioequivalence to the RLD? Can the MNS approach be used?
Thank you very much for this question and for bringing up this issue. At the Office of Generic Drugs, we have developed modeling and simulation approaches that could leverage data from the RLD and other data sources to establish a bridge in the case where the RLD or the RS are not available in the market. In these cases, we do encourage applicants that encounter this type of problems to engage with the agency by submitting a request for a product development meeting if you think that your product would qualify for this type of meeting based on the GDUFA commitment letter, or under the MIA industry meeting pilot program if this meeting is appropriate for you. Just a little bit more, the MIE industry meeting program will be focusing on the modeling and simulation aspects of your proposed approach. So there's some thinking here for you to do before you decide which type of those two meetings will be more appropriate for you. But in any case, we do encourage you to engage with us in handling this issue. Thank you.
Thank you for that response. We have another question that came for you, Eleftheria. What are the guidelines that can describe M&S approaches as alternative to BE studies?
Thank you for this question as well. And thank you for your interest in utilizing modeling and simulation approaches in support of alternative BE approaches. The FDA has issued several general guidances that provide advice on how to develop a modeling and simulation approach. And depending on the modeling approach that you're considering being appropriate for your product or for the question that you would like to answer, you may need to seek the appropriate general guidance. For instance, there are guidances available for physiologically based pharmacokinetic modeling, one type of approach, or computational fluid dynamics modeling, and also population pharmacokinetic approaches or other more empirical modeling and simulation approaches. The FDA has a dedicated website for retrieving the most recent version of these guidance documents, and I encourage you to visit the website and retrieve those. We also are updating our product-specific guidances for certain drug products to include specific recommendations on modeling and simulation approaches. So you'll see that we have included useful advice for certain orally inhaled drug products and nasal products on implementing modeling and simulation approaches. And of course, on more information on how you would implement those approaches, you can again engage with us under a product development meeting or an MIE meeting, so that we can provide feedback on the approach that you're considering. The PSUB meeting may not be appropriate for this type of discussions, especially if you are just developing those. And I think I have discussed during my presentation at what point you can submit a PSUB meeting to help with properly documenting your modeling and simulation approach. Thank you for this question.
All right, thank you again for that response. We actually have one more question for you, Eleftheria. FDA does not review the study protocols during either the PSUB or the PDEV, which may result in a lot of rework during the assessment cycle at the applicant's end, defeating the core objective of having these meetings. How does the agency look into these aspects, which defeat the main objective of having these meetings?
Yes, thank you for this question. I will try to address this question from the modeling and simulation perspective. I'm guessing that it was triggered by my presentation, but others, please feel free to chime in. So we would be submitting a study protocol or any relevant information along with the modeling and simulation approach is extremely useful to us because there are certain aspects of a study protocol or a study that should be properly captured in the modeling and simulation approach that is being utilized. Additionally, a study protocol or a study report helps us understand, have a preliminary high-level assessment of the type of data and the quality of the data that is being used to support the modeling and simulation approach. So you're right, we will not review the study protocol for a PSUB or a product development meeting, but this type of information will be very useful for us in evaluating a modeling and simulation approach in its entirety. I hope that this answer was helpful. Thank you very much for the question.
Okay, thank you. And I'm seeing we might have a comment additionally for this question from Rob or anyone else on our panel.
Yeah, so I can also comment a little bit on the the protocol. Like if you have questions about your protocol, pre-submission meeting is not a time to ask those questions. Use the control correspondence or the product development meeting, whichever is appropriate to your complex product or not pathway. To, if you have questions about the protocol, FDA will answer questions about the protocol, right? We don't do generalized, like, look at my protocol, tell me if there's anything wrong with it questions. But if there's anything you want specific input on, please ask specific questions. And in the context of the meeting and the control correspondence there, you can include the protocol, right? But just include also the questions that you actually want input on from our reviewers so they know what you're actually confused about, right? So I think that's sort of the model, is not look at my protocol and did you find anything wrong with it? It's, do you have any specific questions about the protocol that you want to get input on? But again, those protocol questions are before you did the study. The pre-submission meeting is after you did the study, right? So certainly in your meeting package, you can include the protocol of the study that you are executing, or have completed, right? And then FDA staff, as you sort of explain in that protocol, here's what we did. They may identify things that they have questions about, that they want to understand more about. This can be pointers to you to clarify. So certainly you can include a protocol in the package, but FDA staff are not going to review your protocol as part of this meeting. It's up to you in your presentation and framing and say, here's what we did, here's what's new about it, here's what's novel about our protocol, right? And you want FDA staff to be prepared to review that, because when your application comes in, they are going to look at what you did and the results of the study. So, that's I think a little bit of advice on the question of the protocol evaluations. If you have questions on what you're going to do, use the other pathways to get that question answered before you do the study.
Right. Thank you so much for that additional information and comment. Now I know we've had some technical difficulties, but we'll go ahead and try this question for Pahala. Pahala, the question is, can we request a pre-sub meeting if the applicant chose to submit a 505(b)(2), but if it is for a non-complex drug product?
Thank you for the question. Before I answer that, can you hear me? Nora, can you hear me?
Yes, we are. Okay. We are hearing you. We'll let you know if it's continuing to break up.
So far, so good. Okay. Anyway, the short answer to the question is no. The reason is because the PSUB is in the context of the ANDA, which is like the J application, and not for the NDA application. Thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you for that response. And now we'll move on to another question for you, Pahala. I guess while we have you speaking, will FDA be able to provide feedback on method development and validation for supporting product development? Okay.
Oh, thank you for that question. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Anyway, if I get it correctly, feedback on method development, validation for supporting product development. At least what I can do, I'll just give the high level. If you will, there are two buckets of analytical or test. The first bucket will be the commonly, the typical tests, for example, ID tests, impurity content tests, which is like quantitative limit tests for controlling impurities, tests for API or other excipients in DP. That's like kind of the first bucket. Second bucket, you can call it so-called the non-typical method. Some example would be particle size distribution, global size, viscosity, moisture determination, and so on and so forth, right? With respect to method development, we develop method to test the defined characteristic of the drug substance or drug product, obviously, and then to establish the acceptance criteria. And definitely during the development of the new analytical method, the choice of the analytical instrumentation and the method itself should be selected based on the intended purpose, the scope of the method, and then some of the typically parameters evaluated: specificity, linearity. These are like common parameters: LOD, LOQ, range, accuracy, precisions, and also importantly, during the development of the method, the robustness of the method also should be considered, should be evaluated. And with respect to the validation, by definition, validation is the process of demonstrating that the analytical method is suitable for its intended use, right? So looping back to the dimension of the method development, the methodology, the method and the objective or the procedure should be clearly defined, understood before initiating the validation. And this understanding, absolutely, as I mentioned in the method development part, obtained from scientifically based development and optimization study. And then, kind of mirror the parameters: specificity, linearity, accuracy, precision, range, LOD, LOQ. Those are not for all those tests, but kind of like the typical tests done for the validation. And then lastly, some of the use references. I think these are like well known for recommendation and definition of the development and method validation. Q2 revision 1, the FDA 1994 guidance, validation of chromatography. That's the 2015 FDA guidance on analytical procedure and method validation of drugs and biologics. And a number of USP general chapters, although they are above 1,000, however, they are very useful. Some of the concept and things of that nature to be used in method development and validation. A couple of example: USP 1224, 1225 for validation of competitive procedure, 1226 for the verification of the compendial procedure. I hope I answered the question. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Paula, and glad we could hear a bit more from you that time. We'll go on now to some questions for Partha. Partha, this first question: does FDA have any plans to have similar meeting mechanisms for a CRL response, wherein a potential applicant may request for a pre-CRL response submission meeting for clarifications pertaining to novel approaches in responding to specific deficiency or may not be related to BE study?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think this is sort of a favorite question regarding the post-CRL scientific meeting that we have in GDUFA III. And that pathway is available to provide that novel approach. However, it does have some limitations in terms of a complex product, but also we have given meetings where you wanted to use a unique method or a unique approach, and depending on that, even for sort of presenting or addressing a complex issues, and so that it is really for scientific discussion, in terms of getting our CRL response. CRL. So before you submit the CRL response, as an amendment, you can have this meeting for that type of scientific discussion. So that process is available now in GDUFA III. Within the review time, though, we do have a couple of meetings, namely mid-cycle review meeting and enhanced mid-cycle review meeting, where you have an opportunity to discuss the deficiencies or some of the review issues that we may raise within the discipline review letter. So that mechanism is also available within the review period. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that response. Partha, we have another question for you. Is a PSUB meeting enough to get FDA clarifications and requirements before an ANDA submission? Or may further clarification be requested by FDA after ANDA submission regarding the same complex issue that was discussed previously in the PSUB meeting?
Again, just to clarify, as you said, the pre-sub meeting is essentially a presentation of your data and approaches to the agency. In terms of our more questions around your approach, and then when we get to see the data within the ANDA application, we typically send out information requests to the applicant, and then provide a reasonable time frame to respond to those requests. So that kind of back and forth is very typically done within the application process. So that that mechanism is obviously available. Thank you.
Thank you again for your response. We have a question now for Jan. Will the agency consider a PSUB for an aqueous colloidal solution for a parenteral injection to discuss an in vitro study approach as an alternative to PSG recommended BE study?
Thank you for that question. So here, I think that depends on where you are. So if you are considering an in vitro study approach as an alternative to what is recommended in the PSG, then you should request a pre-development meeting instead of pre-submission meeting. But in case if you have already completed your alternative in vitro-based bioequivalence study, and you would like to present it to the FDA to explain to us how you developed your in vitro alternative B approach and why you think this may be an appropriate approach for establishing bioequivalence of your test product, and you do not expect us to provide specific feedback for resolving any technical questions. In such case, then you could consider a PSUB. But if you still would like to get our feedback on any technical questions to make sure you'll be able to develop an alternative approach, then you should request a pre-development meeting instead. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jan. We have another question that came in for Karen. Karen, as per slide number 6, the PSUB meeting can help receive feedback on items or information that should be clarified. However, slide number 9 said that the PSUB meeting package should not include questions. These two slides are contradictory. Could the agency clarify on what and how the questions be included in the PSUB meeting?
Hi, thanks. That's a great question. So just to clarify that the feedback that the agency gives is going to be based on your presentation, so not in response to specific questions. So through the presentation, FDA assessors will identify areas or information based on what you present that you should clarify before you submit your ANDA. So it's not a response to a specific question that you would ask. It's more in response to your presentation and what may be missing that's been identified during your talk that FDA may ask questions and then provide you feedback during the meeting on those items that need to be clarified, but it's not in response to a specific question. So hope that helps clarify. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And we'll continue with one other question for you. How much time will it take by FDA to confirm if a meeting is granted?
Thank you for that question. So in GDUFA III, the time frame for granting and denying has changed to 30 days. So within 30 days, you'll be notified whether your meeting is granted or denied. And the time frame has been adjusted slightly because during that time, we need to identify the end assessment team. And also, we will provide you in your grant letter any comments on information that you should submit in addition to what you're proposing in your initial meeting request and package. So so you'll be notified within 30 days, essentially, if it's granted or denied. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that information. We have one more follow-up question for you. Can we ask for scientific advice before requesting a PSUB meeting?
Thank you for that question. So the answer is yes. As you've heard many times through this talk and through the panel, if you are seeking scientific advice, regulatory or technical advice, those types of questions should be asked throughout your product development, whether through controlled correspondence or product development meetings. So to determine the most appropriate pathway, definitely check the guidances to see what's within scope of those. But it's always recommended that you come through one of these pathways when you need feedback from the agency. So thank you.
All right, thank you again, Karen. And now we have a question for Jan. When do we start contacting FDA for a pre-submission meeting?
Thank you for that question. As we have discussed in the talk and the panel, our current thinking is if you have identified a complex issue for your ANDA development, once all the studies need to be done for that particular topic, then you can request a pre-submission meeting to present those studies to us to get some feedback. So it's not necessarily you have to wait until towards the end of your program, as long as the portion you would like to present is complete. Thank you.
Right, thank you again. One more question for you, Jan. Will FDA be able to let us know if something is not right or complete?
So thank you for that question. So I think like Patha just mentioned or addressed in a question, at pre-submission stage, we won't be able to let you know the adequacy or final acceptability of a study or data, because those has to be looked at with a lot of additional information. But what we can do is, for instance, like one case I presented in the presentation for complex API, when we expect you to use a list of orthogonal analytical methods to support API sameness, for instance, then if a particular aspect of the characterization of the API is missing, and we can help you spot that based on our experiences, and we will let you know what would be our expectations, and your current proposed studies is still missing that component. So that is the type of feedback we can provide in PSUB meeting request. Thank you.
Thank you again, Jan. Now we'll move on to a question for Eleftheria. In the M&S analysis, example 2, what is important for a prospective applicant to include in their meeting package?
Thank you for this question. So this is the example number 2 that I discussed during the second portion of the talk. that was delivered with Yang. So in this case, the applicant, just to refresh everybody's memory, the applicant had engaged with the agency in the past through the pre-development meeting and received feedback on the methodology of their IVPT study and consequently on the modeling and simulation approach that they were proposing. So in this case, the applicant ideally would submit summaries from previous meetings in their PSUB meeting package. And of course, any novel IVPT data and the accompanying novel modeling and simulation analysis that utilize the novel IVPT data should be included in the PSUB meeting package. In this case, where novel data is included, the FDA will be able to flag any potential issues with that newly generated data and the updated modeling and simulation approach. And this is an important feedback the applicant would want to take into consideration before they submit their ANDA. So this is a very good example where a PSUB meeting can be very beneficial to an applicant. Thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you for the response. Now we have a question for Bill. If we are developing a protocol for a comparative clinical endpoint BE study with some complex features, is it appropriate to present our protocol to the FDA to obtain feedback prior to conducting the actual clinical study?
Hi, thank you for the question. I think that it would be reasonable to come with questions you have around the protocol design. The pre-sub would probably not be the right format for that, whether it's through a control or a product development meeting. I think we're open to looking at questions you have, and I think we've heard earlier that the ideal state would be we have a specific question on this approach or a specific issue that we'd like to discuss, rather than here's our protocol, tell us what you think. So we're open to engaging with applicants and generic drug industry around protocols. Just should be through the right meeting format, and ideally with a specific question for us to think about. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Bill. And let's see if we have time for one last question. This question is actually for Rob. Because the commitment letter only mentions prior PDEV meetings for eligibility, if we have an MIE or PSA instead of a PDEV, could we still be granted a PSUB?
Yeah, we encourage you for those meetings because, to submit, that you can submit PSUB meetings. Again, that's not exactly what's in our commitment letter, but we think that in those situations, those are very similar to the product development meetings. And I think we would, assuming that they were the meeting format and content was appropriate, I think we would expect to grant grant those follow-ups to those other meeting programs if you were using the PSUB meeting program correctly.
All right, thank you. And that looks like that is all the questions we have time for. Thank you again to all our presenters for the excellent information. And now I'll actually turn it back to you, Rob, for some closing remarks.
All right, thank you, Nora. So very happy to be here today and see the interest in the pre-submission meeting. And I really want to thank all of our speakers and presenters and panelists, as well as our SBIA staff, for putting together this webinar, making this resource available, not just to those of you who are listening right now, but also to those of you who will look at this as a resource going forward to say, how can I use the pre-submission meeting better in the future to accelerate and make the review of my application submissions more efficient. And again, as I've mentioned several times during the Q&A parts that I've been involved in here, the important part of this meeting is, and the reason that it's in our commitment letter, which means that both industry and FDA sort of agreed that this was a good idea, was that it's really intended to make the review of the generic drug application more efficient by giving you, the applicant, an opportunity to highlight the novel parts of your application. So you have control over that. You know what's new, what's challenging, bring those to the direct attention of your review team in advance of the submission. The review team can then ask questions, give you feedback, but even if they don't say anything or can't say anything to them because they're not going to prejudge their conclusions until they see all your data, they also can be prepared, and they can also go back and say, all right, this is what the application is going to submit. Do we have a review plan for this? Do we need to do things internally to be prepared for this because this is coming in the next few months? So we think there's a lot of opportunities where this process will make the review more efficient. It'll be especially if you've had other interactions with FDA through other meetings, it's also an opportunity to make sure that all of the things you've done in response to those previous meetings gets bridged into the ANDA review team, and the people who will be reviewing your application, making a final decision on its approvability. So it's, I would say, to me, it seems like it's a fantastic opportunity, and we're just trying through this webinar here to make it as clear as we can what types of situations it will be most useful for, how to prepare the submission packages that fit into this new framework. Because again, it's pretty new and a sort of a different approach than FDA has taken for meetings in the past. And so we really want to take the time to answer questions about it and help you prepare for this and help you use this process. So with that, I thank you all. Look forward to, engaging with many of you through this pre-submission meeting process. We think there are lots of opportunities. We're encouraging to use this pathway when it's appropriate, when you have some type of novel study design that's not usually found in ANDA submissions. Those are the places where FDA really wants you to use this and really will consider, consider those meeting packages. And so with that, I'll turn it back to our SBIA colleagues for their closing logistic remarks.